Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Civilization's Dusk, Roaming in the Gloaming with Iain McGilchrist. 'Tis the hour to walk at will in a wayward unfettered roaming, caring for naught save the charm, elusive and swift, of the gloaming. Lucy Maud Montgomery. When philosophy paints its grey in grey, then has a shape of life grown old. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings, only with the coming of the dusk. Hegel. And I think this is a beautiful illustration of the concept of gloaming, in other words, the dusk, the end of the day, that weird period where it's not fully night time. It's as gloomy can be. And this is my favourite version. I think there were 5 versions of this. The Isle of the Dead by Arnold Böcklin, who was a Swiss, from memory, Swiss artist. And it's been associated with, I don't think Böcklin said much about the meaning behind it. But I think it's been associated with Charon, the idea of going across the river Styx, the ferryman of the dead. You can see the hunched white figure. And it's just a very obviously enigmatic, atmospheric island, very odd, with interior tomb-like spaces. And the theme of today, cheery as ever, is that civilization is represented by this white figure going off into its tomb. Or at least when I say civilization, the notion of literacy. It's been a long time bugbear of mine that my argument is we live in post-literate times, and we're just seeing the final days of literacy if we haven't already left it behind. And everything now is image-based, instantaneous, screen-based, inane communication, and the more reflective, contemplative aspects of both the written word and contemplative visual art are increasingly as rare as hen's teeth and a thing of the past. So, to stop me just degenerating and descending into my patented rampant misery, I wanted to use this guy's work. So this is Iain McGilchrist, and I think his undergraduate degree was in English literature, and then more and more he did research in neuroscience and psychiatry, and he's famous for developing, I'll talk in a second about the specific books, but the corpus of his work is about this, as you can see in the diagram, left hemisphere, right hemisphere distinction. And he's at pains to often argue that it's not about, our brain isn't split into 2 independent halves. They're always working together, but they have a different way of approaching the world. And he explains how, well, and this is common knowledge physiologically, the left-hand side of the brain controls the right-hand side of our body, and the right-hand side of the brain controls the opposite, the left-hand side of our body. And the left hemisphere is much more, that controls the right-hand side, is much more practical. It's grasping. It tends to focus upon the short term and relatively simple patterns, very logical type reasoning, whereas the right-hand side of the brain is much more pattern-based, it's much more reflective, it tends to see the bigger picture, it's less instantaneously responsive. And part of Iain McGilchrist's overall argument is that as a society, we're increasingly letting the left-hand side of our brain dominate at the expense of the right-hand side. And the right hemisphere of the brain is much more closely linked to art, literature, all the things I've argued for a long time that we're steadily losing. They're being eroded from our society. And he's a lovely avuncular chap. He's on loads of video. I've never met the guy, unfortunately, but he's on loads of videos on YouTube and other places, which I encourage you to check out. But you can just see and I partly picked the wryly humorous Roaming in the Gloaming because I believe he lives on the Isle of Skye. And in 1911, there was a popular variety song, Roaming in the Gloaming. So there's a Scottish heritage to it. But I do think there's this lovely notion of, well, not lovely, quite depressing notion of we're in the gloaming of our civilization. We're in the dusk of literacy. And I think Iain McGilchrist is a great way to explore that notion. So these are the books he's most well known for. The first one was like 2009. The Master and His Emissaries. If you want an introduction, that would be the perfect book to pick up, where he gives a broad overview of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere differences and the implications of letting the left hemisphere dominate in our society. And then I think it was 2021, these two large volumes came out, and I can't recommend these books anymore. I think they're absolutely brilliant. The Master and His Emissary is an overview, and it's very accessible. Not to say that the other two, they're more tomish, much bigger books. They still are accessible, but he goes into a huge amount of research and depth. And if nothing else, they're almost like a compendium of brilliant quotes. And one of the reasons I like Iain McGilchrist so much is I've long been like a magpie with quotes, and he quotes all the time, which is great because there's a bit of epistemological humility in the sense that he lets you read and he collates on your behalf lots and lots of views and background information from many, many sources. And so even if you didn't particularly like his argument, which you should, it's a greatly put together books. But if nothing else, there's just a huge range of information and knowledge that he brings to your fingertips, which is just a huge effort. And it's an amazing couple of volumes. They're not cheap, so if you're on a budget, maybe you could get them from a library. But they're beautifully produced books as well. So if you want to treat yourself, the time of year I'm doing this, Christmas isn't that far off. But if you want to treat yourself with a gift or drop massive hints to family members that this is what you'll be reading or like to read on Boxing Day, then I thoroughly recommend them. And this is an interview he did with Hannah Gall, who also has interviewed me in the past, who's a great journalist. And this is his quote from that interview. I believe that over the period from about 600 BC to the present day, Western culture has 3 times repeated a certain pattern. This pattern was followed by both the Greek and Roman civilizations until their final collapse. This pattern begins in a marvellously productive, harmonious collaboration of both hemispheres, drawing on their particular strengths, but gradually and ineluctably it becomes more and more dominated by the left hemisphere's take on the world, at which point it is only a matter of time before the civilization falls to ruin. So I love the guy because he says he doesn't pull any punches. And I think I've been accused by friends and ex-colleagues of being a moaning Cassandra, although it always amused me that Cassandra, if you look back in your mythology, was actually correct. But that's no help. People don't like. They tend to shoot the messenger. But he's actually arguing quite seriously that we are at the dusk of literate society because the left hemisphere of our brain has been privileged, and especially, and this is my area of expertise, the role of technology that has played a massive role. And I'm hopefully preaching to the choir, but if you don't believe me, just look around on any public transport, whether anyone's reading a book, how many people are looking at screens, and even for a second taking it away from issues of literacy. I happen to be a massive football fan, or for North American viewers, soccer, and people are paying a fortune to go to a live game, and when the camera pans into the crowd, person after person is on their mobile phone in the middle of the game. They've paid a huge amount of money to see. And if they're not doing that, so they're either not watching the game because they're busy texting people to tell them what a wonderful time they're having, whilst they're not actually watching the thing they paid a large amount of money for. But if they're not doing that, often they're filming the very thing they're not watching in the moment. There are professional cameras, it's on television. Why are you filming this? But this obsession with screens and this distance it introduces to our direct experience of reality, all these things are linked, and all these things, Iain McGilchrist is a brilliant guide. And I wanted to use his interview with Hannah Gall because she gave the title about context that you can see. So this title, context is everything, because nothing is what it is without a context. And I think that's a great title because it summarises a huge part of what McGilchrist is trying to do. So to keep on this theme of technology, there's this beautiful quote from Marshall McLuhan. And I can't recommend, again, another recommendation for a book, Understanding Media, which my memory is rubbish, but I think it was 1964. And if it wasn't 64, it was 68. I always transpose them. But I think it was 1964. Just before an airplane breaks the sound barrier, sound waves become visible on the wings of the plane. The sudden visibility of sound, just as sound ends, is an apt instance of that great pattern of being that reveals new and opposite forms, just as earlier forms reach their peak performance. And why I like that is I'll explain particularly, but one aspect is you notice how McLuhan uses the word patterns, which McGilchrist picks up on in that quotation I've just given you from his interview. And McLuhan's beautiful summary is that we tend to have the best view of something just as we're leaving it behind. And I think in a previous video I've quoted one of my favourite Leonard Cohen quotes about, I'm sorry I didn't realise you had such a beautiful ass till you walked away from me. So he's annoyed some woman and he's making the point. He has this desirous response to her as she's leaving because he only gets to see her backside at that point from that particular perspective. So it's a cruder version of what, and a more physical version, what McLuhan's talking about with regard to technology. And I think we have entered the end zone of literacy. So I personally would suggest that, the last great novel was maybe James Joyce's Ulysses, when the boundaries of what you could do with language, and if not Ulysses, most James Joyce, the whole idea that he experimented with language to such an extent. But my particular favourite is Ulysses. But I don't think a novel of that complexity, or those range of references, classical references, modern references, it almost was the swan song of the novel. And around about that time, you also had Proust's À la recherche de Pompidou. You had some brilliant, brilliant novels. Around about that time, you've got Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain. So there was a flowering in the 20s and 30s of brilliant novels that I don't think we'll ever see the likes of again. And art does have these crescendos and then falling offs again. So, Elizabethan theatre, the golden age of Greek theatre, there are certain epochs when we're unlikely to see that level of artistic output ever again. But we're in this moment now where we're almost at that point where we can just look back, because literacy is not valued in our society. It's an ever decreasing skill. And this idea that you can just see what you're losing as it's being left behind, I think is quite a powerful idea that McLuhan makes. And I've used this in a previous about the Communist Manifesto video that I did, but this is The Fighting Temeraire by Turner, and it just encapsulates some of the things we're talking about and what McLuhan mentions, because it's Dusk, and you've got the Fighting Temeraire, which fought at the Battle of Trafalgar, being tugged by a steamboat that's much smaller but much more powerful. And Turner's used some poetic license because as it was being carried off to the knacker's yard, its masts wouldn't have been assembled as they are. But it's one last allusion to what was a mighty fighting machine, but of a previous technological epoch. So this is a moment in time where, you know, one epoch is passing and the next one is starting. And this is, you know, the Industrial Revolution as it's beginning, you know, to really reach its peak in the 1800s in the UK. So the power of steam, which is a theme throughout Turner's career. So back to this title that Hannah Gall gave her interview, context is everything, because nothing is what it is without a context. And why I was fascinated with that title she gave the interview is that it reminded me, and I'll be honest, I'm not a massive Derrida fan. If you've ever read any Derrida, I personally find it quite impenetrable. But I think I've said this before as well. It's almost certainly because I'm not bright enough. I honestly think I don't like to dismiss people just because I don't understand them fully. There are people I really, really respect who think Derrida was a genius, but he does get a very hard time to the extent that anyone knows him in public discourse. He's often sneered at, which I think is very unfair. But he has this famous phrase, or relatively famous, if you're a nerd, il n'y a pas de hors texte. And it's been translated, and this is one of the fascinating issues about when philosophy gets translated between different languages. There's many a slip twixt cup and lip, to quote Shakespeare. It has been translated as, there is nothing outside the text. And that is inaccurate. There's a great, brilliant guy who has some YouTube videos, Christopher Watkin, who's an English guy based in Australia. I think it's at Monash University. Apologies if that's wrong. And he has done some interpretations of postmodern thinkers, interestingly, from a Christian point of view. He's an active member of the Reformed Church, and he gives some brilliant insights into the surprising parallels and links between some postmodern thinkers like Derrida and church theology. But anyway, he points out that this is a mistranslation, because with a hyphen, that noun, hors texte in French, actually refers to, if you ever think of old-fashioned books when they have what I think in English is referred to as the frontispiece, there'll be an illustration that encapsulates what the book is about. And what Derrida is actually saying in that quote is that within life and art, when we try and understand society, there isn't a frontispiece. There isn't a page outside the main text that tells you what the text is all about. In the way in which we encounter reality, we're stuck with trying to interpret it. There's no outside. So he's not saying everything is text. What he's saying is our way of being able to understand it, we have to engage with things on a textual basis. And that gets lost in translation, and it's much more subtle than is often allowed for. And this is a quote from McGilchrist. He says there are two responses, and this is one of them. It's something when he's talking about responses to his book, he says people say to him, it's something I knew intuitively at some level, what you were saying. I kind of knew this, but I had no way of putting it into words. And what you've helped me do is to put it into words. And this was my response when I first read him. Other people have a response along the lines of, I'd never thought of it that way. Thank you so much for opening my eyes. I've been banging on at a much lower level than McGilchrist, but in academic books and occasional media appearances. But I have always thought that McGilchrist's key points, they've always been there for me, but he does this encyclopedic approach whereby he does exactly this for some people. He puts into words what intuitively makes sense because he has a scientific background, but an artistic sensitivity and susceptibility to how artists and literary people interpret the world. So he's got this really unique, he spanned, I think C.P. Snow referred to the two cultures, science versus arts and the humanities. And McGilchrist is really unique in the way he manages to bridge both. And I love the way he uses science, neuroscience in particular, and psychiatry to put across his argument that science isn't everything. It's much more convincing, I think, than some dyed-in-the-wool humanists like me just, wittering on and banging on about, oh, why don't people read James Joyce anymore? Whereas he can actually deconstruct science, to use a Derridean phrase, from within itself. So I think that's a very powerful technique that he has. And one aspect, so the second of these Heidegger's propositions is my idea, but Navajo verbs is one of the things he mentions as thousands of little anecdotes or references or little nuggets of ideas that McGilchrist conveys. But one of which is he has a notion of the way in which our experience of reality is embodied in language. Well, first of all, our experience of reality is embodied. Human beings are creatures in the world, which sounds an obvious point, but modern science abstracts from that. So my previous video was all about analytical philosophy and paradoxes and how logic seeks to eliminate paradoxes. And I think McGilchrist really backs up my argument that what art does, it was the argument of the previous video, the art of paradox, that what art does is maintain paradox, explore paradox, and sometimes even perhaps create new paradoxes or expressions of paradoxes. And this notion of Navajo verbs, it relates to language because McGilchrist points out that modern Western languages, we tend to, I think they call nominalist verbs. Our use of verbs tends to always have a name, a named person, a named subject behind them. And nouns dominate Western modern languages compared to, for example, the Navajo example is in Navajo. It's a mostly verb-based language without necessarily named subjects. And that might sound very esoteric linguistic thing, but it actually encapsulates, Heidegger says language is the house of being. It's hugely important. Idiomatic expressions between languages, for example, illustrate how different cultures approach the world differently because of the way they use and experience language, which is the mediation, the filter from their direct experience of reality itself. And so how you use verbs and nouns can have a massive effect. And it relates to the left versus right hemisphere argument of McGilchrist. But Heidegger's prepositions, Martin Heidegger is a deeply, deeply difficult writer. And I struggled with a colleague in the US. I wrote a book, Heidegger and the Media. But one of the things that came out when we were writing that book was, when you look at, in particular, Heidegger's famous Being and Time, Sein und Geist, there is, in German, again, it's how languages work differently. In German, prepositions are used much more than in English. So Dasein is a phrase that Heidegger uses, D-A, the, and then he uses it as one word, but you could hyphenate it, S-E-I-N, Sein being being, so the being. Whereas in English, it's just more amorphous being, you're being, you're just lumping around. But German is much more directional, it's prepositional, the being, Dasein. And that is interesting because Heidegger's prepositions relate to one of the themes I'll be giving you visual examples of in a second. The way in which abstract art, which I'm never been a massive fan of, but the more I've begun to read around the subject, the more I understand and appreciate the way abstract art, in some ways, is trying to do what McGilchrist is promoting, value the right hemisphere, the creative, embodied part of our lives, our reflective aspects, not just the grasping short-term left hemisphere. And all these things, language, art, all the things, literature, all the things I'm claiming we're at the dusk of, that are dying off, are the very things that McGilchrist argues that we've never needed more. But this is the decline of Western civilization. It sounds such a odd thing to say that Western civilization is on the downward slope because of something like the loss of literature and art. But it's always something I've felt, and lots of other people have felt, but it's McGilchrist beautifully puts it into a scientific context and makes it, I think, really persuasive. And one interesting aspect is this concept of the autistic society. So this is from the interview we did with Hannah Gall. Since the Enlightenment, we have progressed into a world where we have lost touch with what the right hemisphere knows, with its wisdom and understanding, an understanding that should be a big part of our lives and would be very valuable to us now. In its place, we have externalized the left hemisphere's view of the world into our surroundings, so that everywhere we look, the view reinforces in us the same left hemisphere bias. As a result, there is a positive feedback loop which is intensifying, resulting in a spread of what one might, for sure, call autistic tendencies, both in children and in the culture in general. Excuse me, just need some water. And as far, I'm not an expert in this area, but I do find it interesting that there's lots of anecdotal evidence, at least, and some scientific evidence that, and it's difficult to disentangle because our diagnoses of autism increasing because the diagnostic techniques are more sophisticated than they ever used to be? Or is autism as a phenomenon becoming increasingly prevalent? And if not autism specifically, it seems that mental illness in general, and without going into the politics of it, identity issues have never been more in the forefront. And just largely, especially young people, being, I love the word discombobulated, but ill at ease in their own bodies and ill at ease in relating to the world around them. And this is being compounded by technologies, I would always argue, but also social events or cultural events like lockdown has obviously exacerbated this as well. So there's been a perfect storm. But behind it all, according to McGilchrist, is also this over-reliance upon the left hemisphere and the rational, schematic, systematic, borderline, or left to its own devices, the left hemisphere has autistic tendencies. And that is being exacerbated by the downgrading of the values promoted by right hemisphere thinking. So to give you some practical examples of this, this is a famous painting, Black Square by Kazimir Malevich. And it goes right back to the basic essence of arguably existence. And I'm going to have to do a whole section, a future video, and I will. It's not an empty promise. I'm not just threatening you. I'm going to punish you with one. But the whole Black Square, it's... In the previous video, I quoted from King Lear, nothing comes of nothing. Well, a whole abstract art movement came from this type of almost nothing. And what I'll do when I explore Malevich's work is use Arthur Schopenhauer, who happens to be my favourite philosopher of all time. And he was a piece of work. So I have to apologise for his rabid misogyny. He wrote one of the single most offensive essays about women. But if you can park that to one side, he was hugely influential initially, at least, on someone like Nietzsche. And his notion of the world as will and representation, which I'll explain in absolute detail at a future date, informed the work of people like Malevich, or could be used to interpret this work and help people derive a lot more meaning. And just to give you a very brief back of an envelope explanation of Schopenhauer's work, one of the it's dark humor for me, because he basically came to the miserable conclusion that the only purpose in life was to avoid pain and suffering, and there was no better purpose. There was, nothing else to aspire to. And I'm a lazy couch potato, so maybe I'm just like I have a predilection to believe that. But that's one aspect. But then he also had this notion of, he borrowed from Eastern philosophy. He was influenced by Eastern philosophy, and I think I'm right in saying that Iain McGilchrist is a Taoist in terms of his own belief system. But Schopenhauer was influenced by this idea that he called it will, but the idea that behind the world is a life force. And it's, had obviously an influence on Nietzsche's notion of the will to power. But the will, it's an undercurrent of energy in the world, and Schopenhauer explores it in lots of vivid depth. But that's for another time. But back to this concept of autism, because I want to just I've shown you an art example, and I'm going to keep giving you artistic visual examples of some of the things McGilchrist is talking about, and I'll be doing that more after this. So again, this is from the Hannah Gall interview. I should say that in my view, autism isn't a single simple entity, but an aspect which is almost universal is that everything must be made explicit. I've showed you the previous Malevich, the black square, because that is obviously not explicit, it's confusing. The left hemisphere understands effectively only explicit meaning, whereas the right hemisphere importantly understands implicit meaning. Another related difference is that the right hemisphere understands the meaning of context, and that things change when the context changes, whereas the left hemisphere thinks that whatever exists in one context is what it would be in any other context. The context of embodiment, and sorry, this is a separate, I'm taking from the interview in various parts, but this was a separate sentence. The context of embodiment is being eroded. And why I showed you that Malevich, the black square painting, and why I'm going to show you other examples from abstract art, is that for all its faults and for all the way in which many people feel a bit alienated from abstract art, they don't get it. It's not figurative enough. And that for a long time has always been my response. But the more I've read about it, just to repeat myself, the more you read people like Iain McGilchrist, and the more you read about how we're losing touch with an embodied experience of the world, abstract art actually is trying to go right to the essence of existence. So that black square, it draws you in. You're trying to understand what's going on. You're forced to reflect upon its meaning, about its haptic qualities, its sense of, we'll get into it in a second, but there's a sense of motion, there's a sense of touch, texture. It's abstract art, but it's actually engaging. It's almost like a misnomer, because it's engaging quite forcefully with what abstraction actually is. Whereas I think McGilchrist's argument is the left hemisphere uses abstraction in a utilitarian, short-termist fashion. You don't reflect upon it. You're just grasping, you're using bureaucratic schemas, you're using a very limited form of rationality. Whereas things like abstract art force you to stop and contemplate. And often you can have a visceral reaction to abstract art. It actually, there's a response you feel. I'll be giving you an example in a second of Jackson Pollock's Vortex. You get drawn in. And that fosters a reflection upon the way in which we're embodied in the world. The left hemisphere thinking doesn't. Left hemisphere thinking is driving that out of our natural experience. So here's an example of, I'm just talking, ekphrasis, talking about art, but obviously you need to see examples. So here's one. And this is Robert Rauschenberg from 1951, helpfully titled Untitled. And this is what I mean about the tactile quality. And it's, you know, very large canvas. Almost things are coming out at you. And there's the distinction to be made between the surface and the depth. There's a lot going on in what is just something black. And I thought this was appropriate for the theme of dusk and darkness. And again, I will be doing an art of blackness. I'll be doing a whole video on particularly dark, black, abstract art. And this might be more famous, or you more likely have seen this, but this is a Mark Rothko, again, Untitled or Black on Grey. And what was vaguely funny was I wanted to show you a abstract painting number 5 by a guy called Ad Reinhardt, but it's, and I think he was aware of this, it's very difficult to show in a reproduction because the black, there is a cross within the black. It's pure black. It's a totally black canvas, but there's a hint of a cross on it. But it's very, very difficult to see that in any reproduction, especially via a computer screen. So I haven't shown it. And I think to some extent, Reinhardt was aware of this. And it makes you, you know, there are plenty of reasons why I previously didn't like abstract art. But ironically, of all the art that you actually do need to be at a gallery to appreciate properly, potentially abstract art fits the bill because it really doesn't suit. You don't get the gradations of the dark colours and the minimalism. Ironically, you need to be there in person to fully appreciate what isn't there, if that makes sense. But this is just, you know, minimalist abstract. And I won't go into, because like I say, I need to do this in more depth. But for whatever reason, I always look at that and almost think of the surface of the moon. It's there isn't an arc, but I always get the sense if you came back out of that painting and saw a bigger version, it would be the circular shape of a figure like the moon. But that's a completely personal response. But again, it goes to this notion that, to me, it actually it invites contemplation. It invites this. I just keep repeating the word visceral. It's almost like I feel paintings like this in the pit of my stomach, as well as then conceptually thinking about them. But I think it goes straight to the idea of the way in which we're embodied in reality. It's almost trying to bypass your excessively conceptual, excessively rational left hemisphere way of thinking. It's trying to overreach that. And I think this is where the right hemisphere comes into play. And then this is a painting, and what I said earlier was I don't think Iain McGilchrist, and this isn't a criticism, he doesn't talk an awful lot about visual art, partly because he's trying to, the Matter with Things, 2 volumes, it's huge. There's thousands of references. And he obviously didn't have time to do everything. It's impressive enough what he did do. But this is one of the examples he does specifically talk about in terms of visual art. Rene Magritte. So this is what he actually says in volume 1 of The Matter with Things. Much of Magritte's work plays with levels of reference and the relationship between presence and representation, and that added emphasis is mine. In La Belle Captive, The Beautiful Captive, the frame on the easel contains something that looks like a representation of the seascape in front of the viewer, so placed to overlap with it exactly. Is it, or is the frame merely empty, the seascape continuously present? The fact that the living fire, surreally breaking from the tuba on the beach, creates a glow on the area within the frame suggests a third possibility, that it is a blank piece of glass, something we need to see through. And I think that's a great way of summarising the relationship between presence and representation. Magritte is trying to get us, and the surrealists in general, and later, as I'll be talking about, the abstract artists, they're trying to get you to reflect upon this relationship between presence and representation. Whereas in our left hemisphere, technologically dominated world of today, presence is uncritically presented to us via screens. So it's a lack of presence presented to us as mediated screen-based presence. It's an oxymoronic situation where things are presented to us incredibly realistically, but they're very much divorced from practical embodied experience. Everything's via screens. So it seems to be real, but actually it's disembodied. Whereas the surreality of the surrealists, that picture you've just seen by Magritte, is actually trying to get you, unrealistic as it appears, it's actually trying to get you to ponder the nature of reality itself. It's trying to grab you back to reality. And this is another example which I think ties into the previous video I did about Plato's cave. There's obvious connotations here. Magritte's making, he calls it la condition humaine, the human condition. And a slightly subjective response, but that made me, I've always associated these two. And just to give you some example, some context, that painting, it's a Jackson Pollock, but it's actually on like a ledge. So if you can see at the bottom, that's not part of the painting. It's on a stone ledge, and you can also see behind the painting the wall of the gallery, or wherever it's been, because I think it's in a private collection. So I think this was photographed in the New York Metropolitan Museum, but as far as I know, it's in a private collection now. But the way you're drawn into, it's called the vortex. The way you're drawn into that. Again, it's back to this concept of the embodied experience of a seemingly abstract art form. But back to Magritte. So the notion, there are two very important aspects of Magritte's work: presence of mind and mystery. So the basic thing, whether in art or life, is, and this is from Magritte himself, he's saying this, the basic thing, whether in art or in life, is presence of mind. Presence of mind is unpredictable. Our so-called will does not control it. We are controlled by presence of mind, which reveals reality as an absolute mystery. So presence is the opposite, ironically, of what we're being presented by things like social media. It's the absence of mind. It's the constant presence of images. It's the constant presence of a deluge of digitality, digital images. But that creates absent-mindedness, not presence of mind. And Magritte is arguing for we are controlled by presence of mind, but then he's saying which reveals reality as an absolute mystery. So there's this paradox, which, with reference to the previous video about logical paradoxes, Magritte is embracing the concept of paradox, the relationship between presence of mind simultaneously with the notion of mystery. So those two things are held together in Magritte's artwork. Whereas I mentioned Willard Quine and his work on paradox, and I love his surgeon's blade of logical thinking. I think it's beautiful in and of itself, but it's the opposite of this. There's a place for pure logic. I'm not denigrating it, but it's not. It's again, McGilchrist is not saying you can do without the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere and the right hemisphere need each other. If nothing else, I love reading Willard Quine's work because it's so purely logical. I enjoy it in and of itself, but it also makes me appreciate things like this even more, because I also have a massive sense of what Quine's approach to thinking excludes and what art and literature contains. But this notion of being at home with absolute mystery. Mystery, without which no world, no thought would be possible, corresponds to no doctrine and does not deal with possibilities. Thus, a question such as how is mystery possible is meaningless, because mystery can be evoked only if we know that any possible question is relative only to what is possible. So I'll explain with practical examples what that means. But just to repeat, so you're saying mystery doesn't deal with possibilities. Thus, a question such as how is mystery possible is meaningless, because mystery can be evoked only if we know that any possible question is relative only to what is possible. So this relates to the self-limiting nature. When you look at, in the previous video about the logic of paradoxes, some paradoxes only exist within pure logic because you failed to excise the absurdity that in reality these paradoxes just wouldn't make sense in actual reality. Ironically, it's only when you exist in a world of pure logic that some of these paradoxes can occur, because you're not allowing language to do its mysterious work of not being completely logical. Logical paradoxes occur because vagueness is baked into language, but when you try and pretend that there is a pure logical language, you suddenly encounter the vagaries and vagueness of language, and you have to start putting all this mental work into excising them, getting rid of them, and you create this ever more abstract, sometimes, like I've said, quite beautiful, logical world where you get rid of as many paradoxes as possible. Whereas this, what Magritte's talking about, is not. So to give you an example of an actual Magritte painting. So this is time transfixed. And I've put my own notes there, mystery of the concrete. So this is an example of that previous quote about what mystery is. This is how mystery relates to the possibilities of objects, the concrete. Excuse me. So what he's done here is, this also relates to, I think in previous videos I might have mentioned Freud's notion of unheimlich, the German word for uncanny, which literally means unhomely. And an aspect of the uncanny is when things you're familiar with are represented to you in a form that makes you feel uncomfortable, or they don't seem in it, the juxtaposition just seems odd. And here's a great example. So you've got a steam train coming through a fireplace, and the steam train represents to some extent motion, and you've got a clock representing time. So time and space are being represented, but in a weird domestic surreal setting. And the smoke is going up the chimney. So that's making sense in a situation that doesn't make sense. And that's Magritte playing with things that don't go together. It reminds me of that Sesame Street, one of these things does not quite belong, song for people of a certain generation. And when I saw this, it reminded me of a previous video with Giorgio de Chirico. But you've got the same steam train. You've got the clock. So you've got the passage of time. But you've also got the allusion to classical culture in a setting that's obviously much more modern. And also a desert light. You've got classical architecture. You've got the anomaly of the flags are going to the left in the top, middle. But the steam from the train, is the wind is going to the right. So I'm just pointing, I just thought it was vaguely interesting that there's vaguely similar content, but both artists are actually getting you to think about the relationship of time and space. But with regard to, this is a great explanation from Paul Crowther in Magritte's comments about presence of mind and mystery. In these cryptic remarks, Magritte is indicating that the congruence between thought and its objects is a function of coherent context, but that the possibility of this relation, and indeed the questioning of mystery itself, are beyond the range of any answer. In its most ultimate and absolute character, reality itself is without raison d'etre. It exceeds all logic and strategies of comprehension. It has the character of absolute contingency. Which is reinforcing my point about Magritte is trying to do the impossible. He's trying to engage with the fact that reality, the mystery of reality, to show that there isn't any ultimate meaning. Reality itself is without raison d'etre. It exceeds all logic and strategies of comprehension. So Magritte's use of such anomalous, odd combinations of things, which is a trademark of surrealist art, that's exceeding all logic and strategies of comprehension. That's deliberate. And he's asking you to confront the character of absolute contingency. So the previous example of the train coming through the fireplace is the concept of objects, the mystery of objects. And this is, so that was mysteries at an objective level. This is referred to, from memory, this is in the McGilchrist book as well, I think. I might be wrong. But this is mystery at a subjective level. No, sorry, this isn't in the McGilchrist book. This is again in the Crowther book. But mystery at a subjective level. Though again, the human condition. So if you can keep that image in your mind's eye. This is Magritte's own word. These are Magritte's own words. The tree in the picture hid the tree behind it, outside the room. For the spectator, it was both inside the room within the painting and outside the real landscape. This is how we see the world. We see it outside of ourselves, and at the same time, we only have a representation of it in ourselves. In the same way, we sometimes situate in the past that which is happening in the present. Time and space thus lose the vulgar meaning that only daily experience takes into account. And I'd ask you to really concentrate on that. Time and space thus lose the vulgar meaning that only daily experience takes into account. Because I've become fascinated by that notion of vulgarity, not in the normal sense, but as you can apply it to art and experience of reality in the vulgar sense. So I'll show you in a minute. I think one of the basic dictionary definitions of vulgar is coarse and commonplace. And ironically, that's what some art is trying to get you to think about, because by definition, if something's coarse and commonplace, we tend not to focus upon it. It tends to get subsumed under everyday experience. And here he's saying that only daily experience takes into account. So this reminds me of Proust again, the idea that Proust wrote this huge 2,500 page novel, La Recherche de Pompidou, trying to give full significance and valency to the notion of reality, everyday reality, in an incredibly poetic and literary way. But that's what his involuntary memories he describes throughout the novel. He goes into so much detail describing everything, because that's what we pass over in daily experience, but is actually life. So this is further explanation from Paul Crowther, who I think, by the way, is a brilliant writer about art. So the simple dualities, I mean, this again is about that painting of the human condition, what you saw through the window. The simple dualities of internal and external, past and present, are brought into a relation that is antagonistic. Excuse me. The pictured landscape is relatively unremarkable, as is the one behind, with which it is exactly isomorphic, in other words, exactly the same shape. But their exact conjunction renders them both strange. Inner and outer are both identical with, yet distinct from one another. Likewise, whilst it is the pictured landscape which occupies present awareness by concealing the background, yet, viewing the work as though it were a real scene, it is the concealed background which is, as it were, the real space of the present. The pictured landscape is simply a product of the past. In other words, a putative opposition of past and present is rendered in a way that affirms simultaneous identity and difference. We are thence led once more to that higher state of awareness wherein the mystery of being is declared. So I'm sorry if it's wordy, but it's Magritte is trying. This is the relationship between words and pictures. Crowther is trying to put into words, into conceptual terms, what Magritte is also trying to express through sheer visuality. But both of them are trying to express the inherent antagonism in our experience of reality. That we're simultaneously experiencing and representing in our own heads what is happening outside of us. So this inside-outside paradox is, again to use the phrase, baked in to the human experience. Whereas when you deal with pure logic, you're trying to get rid of any tensions. You're trying to create a whole world of abstract purity. Magritte's picture is trying to portray how the inside-outside is inherent in human subjectivity, how we experience the external objective world. And that is, as Crowther puts it, wherein the mystery of being is declared. Sorry, I got rid of myself prematurely. But this goes, so I was referring earlier to just shortly before, the concept of vulgarity as coarse and commonplace. And in an essay he called it On Vulgarity, John Ruskin, it was a book called Modern Painters, he offers various ideas about vulgarity, but just a couple are dullness of bodily sense. Well, that relates to, and I think this is a theme that McGilchrist pursues, and also Louis Sass, who McGilchrist quotes at various points. Sass, I've used in previous videos, wrote a book called Madness and Modernism. And both McGilchrist and Sass, I think they've worked together in the past. One aspect of schizophrenia, for example, is a disassociation from your body, a feeling uncomfortable. And Sass writes about how modern society is arguably on a schizoid autistic spectrum. And it would help explain why so many people now, much more than ever before, feel uncomfortable in their own bodies. And if not their own bodies, they feel uncomfortable in relation to external reality. Perhaps, partly at least, because as in the Magritte picture, that differentiates antagonistically between the indoor room, the outside, and the representation of what lies behind on the surface level of the easel. Those type of confusions between inside, outside, and representations of the outside that happen to be on the inside, this complex relationship, interrelationship, that's exacerbated. There's people inside their bedrooms, young people, all they're doing is looking at representations of the outside, that they never go out and smell the trees and put their feet in the grass type of thing. There's this disjuncture, constant representations without physical embodied experience, and people wonder why everyone's miserable. All of which comes of insensibility. So dullness of bodily sense and insensibility. This idea that one aspect of vulgarity defined by Ruskin is dullness, a failure to feel. And I'd suggest Magritte's notion of Magritte's almost trying to reclaim the vulgar, reclaim daily experience, so that it's not just passed over. It's actually felt as lived, embodied experience. And I've come across this recently. I absolutely love this quotation. The black battle stain on a soldier's face is not vulgar, but the dirty face of a housemaid is. So, in the gendered language, be careful here, but the gendered language of Ruskin's time, what he's suggesting is, this goes to Hanegal's title, specifically, the importance of context. The dirty face of a housemaid who's just, scrubbing floors, that's vulgar, that's coarse and commonplace. Whereas the dirt on a soldier's face, because it's in the context of fighting for a cause, defending liberty, whatever you want to put on the activity of a soldier, that context profoundly changes how that blackness is viewed. And I'd suggest that is a way of thinking about the blackness of abstract, minimalistic modern art. It's trying to make what could be dismissed as vulgar into an aesthetically experienced, non-passed over re-acclimatization with embodiment, with all the things that screen culture is getting rid of. Left hemisphere bias, dragging us back into right hemisphere contemplation, reclaiming the vulgar as a source of contemplation rather than something just to be dismissed. So bringing this to an end, I've become more and more fixated on the work of Jackson Pollock. And I've been talking about the way in which in modern or contemporary screen culture, everyone's looking at screens, everyone's looking at everybody else looking. Well, the idea of eyes and the heat. If you look closely, there are eyes throughout this absolute morass, looking back at us, looking at the morass. And I'm beginning, like I say, I would be immensely chuffed if more people like myself, who was very philistinistically anti-Pollock for a long, long time, I would be interested if I can try and persuade you. And if you read more McGilchrist, who doesn't, I don't think he mentions, I think he might mention once or twice, but I'm not sure he mentions Pollock a lot, if at all. I need to look it up. But I think if you read McGilchrist, I think you'd begin to see another side and rationale for Pollock's work. I just love Pollock's nickname, Jack the Dripper. It's one of my favourite artistic nicknames. But maybe I'm just getting senile. I could look at that all day. Maybe I need to get a more active life. And then this is potential. I keep saying, because I'll show you another one and say that's my favourite, but this is potentially my favourite Jack the Dripper painting. I think because it's called Full Fathom 5, and it's influenced by this quote from The Tempest, full fathom, okay, difficult to say. Full fathom 5, thy father lies. Of his bones a coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. And I used that in a previous video on the girl with the pearl earring, when I talk about, the cultural references of pearls. And plot spoiler, that whole video, if you want to go back and look at it, is that the irony of the girl with the pearl earring is it's not a real pearl. But again, the idea, the sea, the bottom of the sea, the complete morass that Pollock can produce. And this all makes me think of abstract art and a society of abstraction. This is my concluding argument, that for me, abstract art, we are in a society of abstraction, and abstract art's value is to actually help us understand the significance of that. Which I hope isn't too convoluted, but I until I realise this in my own head, I struggle to appreciate abstract art at all. And this is from, it'll come at the end, is this Ouspensky, a Russian esoteric thinker. I'm pretty sure he was Russian. We are receiving as sensations and projecting into the outside world as phenomena the immobile angles and curves of the fourth dimension. On this account, is it not necessary and possible to realise that the world is immobile and constant, and that it seems to us to be moving and evolving simply because we are looking at it through the narrow slit of our sensuous receptivity? And this, to do this quote full justice, would take at least a couple of hours. I'm not joking, but I wanted to show you this as an introduction to the final slide I wanted to show you, which is Ouspensky was I think I said, esoteric thinker, and he had some weird notions, but this, I've emphasized there, the immobile angles and curves of the fourth dimension. It's a bit like the crowd that comments about Magritte. When I do a video on Schopenhauer and the concept of, and this also lies behind McGilchrist, to bring it right back to McGilchrist's work, the idea that life is some type of flow, that we experience objects with the Magritte painting. We experience three-dimensional objects through a series of filters. I think this is what this is Ouspensky quote is relating to. But just to repeat, to segue into this final slide, that'll be a Jackson Pollock picture. On this account, is it not necessary and possible to realise that the world is immobile and constant, and that it seems to us to be moving and evolving simply because we are looking at it through the narrow slit of our sensuous receptivity? It's that final phrase, through the narrow slit of our sensuous receptivity. And I have talked about in the past ekphrasis, talking about visuality. And I think that's a beautiful phrase, through the narrow slit of our sensuous receptivity. But B, the image I'm going to show you, I think, brilliantly illustrates, better than I could ever put into words, my explanation of these words. I think the correspondence of these words and the image you're about to see, talking about a big build-up, but the image you're about to see, I just think this is how words and images can go together, and they're greater than the sum of their individual parts. So it'll be a massive anticlimax if you're not convinced at all. But anyway, so I'll finish with a Pollock slide. Till the next time, all the very best. Bye.